If you've ever picked up a book by Nietzsche, then you'll have to admit it's a rather unique experience. You might love it, you might hate it, but you can't deny that it's unforgettable. That's because the German philosopher wrote in what we call aphorisms. Short passages like little bombs of pure thought. Much like hobbits, you can read an aphorism in no time, and yet on the 100th return it can still surprise you.
What about second breakfast?
By and large, these thought bombs stand alone, and so if one goes completely over your head, you can just keep moving. This is what makes the task of reading Nietzsche both brutally disorienting, but also oddly forgiving. You might miss what's going on in this aphorism but hit something life-changing or mind-altering in the next one. That has always been my experience of reading him. This is what gives Nietzsche's work so much vitality and such a rereadability factor. His aphorisms are the gifts that keep on giving. This is the first ever book of Nietzsche's that I owned, and as you can tell by the beat up shape of it, and it has this quote on the front from Walter Kaufmann that I'm not sure if you can see there, but he says that Nietzsche is one of the few philosophers since Plato whom large numbers of intelligent people read for pleasure. And if we flick through inside, you can see that some of these aphorisms are super short, like this one 106, which is just 6 words long. But as you can see, most of them are somewhere between a paragraph and a page, with the longest one I can find being this number 260, which is about 4 full pages. These are all aphorisms from Beyond Good and Evil, by the way. When you first encounter this, you might be wondering what the hell Nietzsche is up to. Why can't he write like a normal person with a start, a middle and an end? A few premises leading up to a conclusion, a set of points that converge on a denouement. The answer lies in his way of thinking. As he showed in the work of his most popular in academia on the genealogy of morals, he is more than capable of writing in this linear fashion that we are used to. But that book is the exception among his later works. The thing is that this just isn't how Nietzsche philosophized. He wasn't a sit at your desk and rigorously work through your thoughts kind of guy. The reason why his thinking is so dynamic and why it has been the love of everyone from far-right fascists, far-left postmodernists to far-out techno-optimists is that his writings are overflowing with life. He doesn't get hung up on evolving one thought. His philosophy isn't that of the diligent cartographer mapping out the topography of an established territory. Nietzsche is less Mason-Dixon and more Lewis and Clark. With On the Genealogy of Morals, he was obviously fascinated enough by one train of thought that he settled down to develop it in a more traditional intellectual style. But aside from that, he preferred to keep moving and keep evolving. The other exception to the rule, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, only amplifies this impression. It was a bizarre biblical sort of text that wasn't aphorism, but certainly wasn't your linear academic style either. This light-footedness allows him to explore a thought that comes up and just as quickly let it go and never talk about it again, like he did with the Übermensch. Instead of getting hung up on one big idea like Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog, Nietzsche epitomizes Berlin's fox who knows many things and explores a broad territory. The key to understanding the fertility of the aphoristic fox Nietzsche is to understand how he thought, and the key to this thinking process is walking. The sedentary life is the very sin against the Holy Spirit. Only thoughts reached by walking have value. Nietzsche never had the best health, and by his mid-30s it got so bad that he had to retire from his professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the ripe age of 35. It's interesting to note that his works up to this point, The Birth of Tragedy and the 4 essays of Untimely Meditations, were all linear pieces. But in the 9 years between his retirement and his steep descent into madness at the age of 44, Nietzsche wrote his greatest works from The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra to Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals and The Twilight of the Idols. And it is no coincidence that as his writing was ramping up, so too was his walking. The year after leaving Basel, he began his migratory existence in search of the promised land where his health would improve. One of the places he stayed was in the German Black Forest, where he wrote, "I am walking a lot through the forest and having tremendous conversations with myself." During this phase, he was walking 1 hour in the morning and 3 hours every afternoon. As the years went on, this ramped up. A couple of years later, he wrote, "I would walk for 6 or 8 hours a day, composing thoughts that I would later jot down on paper." And within a couple more years, he would proclaim that he was doing 10 hours a day of hermit's walking. It should go without saying that this very sick man probably wasn't walking 10 hours straight a day. Assume what he means is that he was on the trail for 10 hours, and I'm sure a large chunk of that time was spent jotting in his notebook, capturing the insights that were fed to him. This would be no way for a hedgehog to write. The hedgehogs like Kant or Hegel would find this to be a nuisance. Their work is done in a chair at a desk. They are diving down on one thought, and so sustained laser focus is their superpower. Theirs is an active thinking. But that is not the only type of thinking, and it certainly wasn't Nietzsche's way. His aphoristic works were exemplars of passive thinking. He was just the one writing it down and feeding it new sources of inspiration in the form of books and conversation. From there, the psyche and the muse cooked it up and fed new philosophy to him bit by bit. And that is where the walking is so essential. The alchemists are of the opinion that the artifacts is the servant of the work, and that not he, but nature brings the work to fruition. As long-time followers of the channel will be aware, last summer I walked the most famous hiking trail in Europe, the Camino de Santiago, which starts in the French Pyrenees and makes its way 500 miles across the north of Spain to the city of Santiago, where legend has it that the apostle of Jesus, St. James, Santiago, is buried. Along with Rome and Jerusalem, it's one of the 3 classic pilgrimages of Christianity. There's a beautiful week on that trek after my mind had settled, but before it had become the social affair that the Camino inevitably turns into. It was the week I understood Nietzsche's creative process, because I was experiencing it. Now, I'm not saying I'm a new Nietzsche or anything. God knows the world doesn't need another one of those. What I'm talking about is a certain groove, a certain rhythm that Nietzsche's way of thinking and his creative process worked by. On the days of this week, I would rise as usual in the early hours of the morning and I would set off hiking. In the 2 or 3 hours before my first breakfast stop, my mind would be idling over. I would be in what Chris Bailey calls scatter focus, where I let my mind wander freely where it would. I'd be looking at the beauty around me, the fields of wheat and oats rippling like a cereal ocean in the morning light. And inevitably, my mind would wander to mundane business. How long to the next stop? How many kilometers today? What was I going to have for breakfast? And so on and so forth. And then I'd be back on the trail, drinking in the beauty and looking down the path ahead as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. It was like lying in a boat in a cove, with the boat bobbling now towards the internal world and now towards the external world. And then, in the midst of these circling reveries and sensations, there would be a loud bang of inspiration. My mind would be filled with racing thought, like a letter had just arrived from the gods. And then I would greedily unpack this insight, ravaging it from every angle to see what was in it. And then when I had wrung all the archetypal ambrosia out of it, my mind would naturally return to its reveries until I reached the next village. And there I would stop, have a cup of coffee and a pastry, take out my notebook and record the insight that had come to me. And with my physical and creative hungers satiated, I'd get back on the trail and walk and fall back into reverie until another bang of inspiration would strike, and once again I'd greedily sift through the insight until there was nothing left for my mind to grip onto. And then another delicious café con leche and the notebook out again to give flesh to the thought on paper, and then on I would go again. This cadence continued for a whole week, with insight after insight emerging in each session of walking writing. Somewhere in that week it crystallized for me. This is exactly how Nietzsche wrote his works. I recognized it in the style of what was emerging. It's like I could hear the same drummer that he heard. Or, to use the language from the channel update, which I stole from the great Stephen Pressfield, who stole it from Homer, I was inspired by the same muse. This was the muse of walking. As I flicked through these notebooks, I noticed that there were common themes between the various bits of writing, but each one stood alone, separate, and yet coming from the same substrate. It gave new meaning to the idea of the living philosophy. a double meaning, where I realised that this philosophy was something that I merely had to attend to. If I walk and I write, then this philosophy will keep showing up in eureka after eureka, and it will unfold and evolve and transform. It wasn't that the philosophy was about living, which was the original meaning of the term for me, but that the philosophy itself was alive and evolving. And that's what I see in Nietzsche's philosophy. It was something living. To use a philosophical metaphor that goes all the way back to Socrates, Nietzsche was a midwife to a philosophy rather than the creator. Of course, the process wasn't entirely passive. It wouldn't have happened if Nietzsche was sitting at home watching 19th century Seinfeld. It happened because he was walking. I insist that people should finally stop confounding philosophical labourers and scientific men generally with philosophers. Precisely at this point, we should be strict about giving each his due, and not far too much to those and far too little to these. It may be necessary for the education of a genuine philosopher that he himself has also once stood on all these steps on which his servants, the scientific labourers of philosophy, remain standing, have to remain standing. Nietzsche isn't the first walking philosophy in the field's distinguished history. Both Plato and Aristotle's school of philosophy in ancient Greece were founded in gymnasiums. While Plato's thinkers were named after the school itself, the academics, Aristotle's school of thinkers were instead named the Peripatetics, the walking philosophers. Henry David Thoreau was another zealous advocate of walking, saying that his health and spirits required at least 4 hours a day sauntering through the woods and over the hills and fields to remain in top shape. And if we want to emulate Nietzsche, there's an important insight that Thoreau hints at in his book Walking. I am alarmed when it happens that I have walked a mile into the woods bodily without getting there in spirit. In my afternoon walk I would fain forget all my morning occupations and my obligations to society, but it sometimes happens that I cannot easily shake off the village. The thought of some work will run in my head, and I am not where my body is. I am out of my senses. This from Thoreau, who was used to walking 4 hours a day. I found that even in my 1 to 2 hour daily walks, there's not enough time to shake off the village. As I was saying with my Camino experience, I didn't slip into the aphoristic writing mode immediately. It took more than a week before the dust had sufficiently settled that I could really feel that I'd left the village behind. By the same token, the weeks after that golden week of inspiration weren't philosophically fruitful, because I'd found a whole new village in my fellow Camino hikers. So it's not merely a matter of walking or of walking alone, something which I still did for the most part in the weeks after my inspired week. It's a question of letting the dust of the village settle. It's in this quietness that the muse can emerge. It's funny that part of what makes Nietzsche's life so undesirable, the isolation and lack of love and connection, though it's worth noting that's not as much as it's usually portrayed, that this is what made him so fertile. It's the double-edged sword of the hermit. It reminds me of a line of Emerson's that, when half gods go, the gods arrive. Or of Blake's, God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who live in realms of day. Nietzsche walked in his solitude, and out of that walking came aphorism after aphorism, so that the writing of his books must have seemed relatively easy, like a clown pulling tissues out of their sleeve. Of course, there's a massive caveat that has to be added. What we've explored in this episode is how to think like Nietzsche, in the sense of tapping into the fertile rhythm of his inspiration. But Nietzsche's works are so powerful and valuable to the extent that he is rooted in the Western intellectual tradition. If you can name a philosopher or great writer from the previous 2 millennia, then Nietzsche probably takes a stab at them at some point. There's much talk about the ugliest of all, Socrates, Descartes, the father of rationalism and the suicide of the European intellect. Some talk of Napoleon and Hegel and the Chinese of Königsberg, Immanuel Kant. Nietzsche's writings are so enjoyable because they are like a guided tour through the history of thinking. His reservoir of knowledge is vast, and this was the prima materia he was working with when he went out walking. These were the ingredients that the psyche had to cook with, and my lord did they cook. That's everything for this episode of The Living Philosophy. I'd like to thank David Pilibosian, Sasha Canthan, and all the other patrons for their support of the channel. If you'd like to get access to bonus content like book clubs, long-form interviews with creators and experts, live stream monthly Q&As, or if you just want to support the channel and get your name in the credits like these wonderful people, then you can head over to Patreon. As ever, if you have any thoughts, insight, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.